Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know me, always up for a good old-fashioned deep dive into pretty much anything. But gotta say, the question you guys put to us this time, it's kind of keeping me up at night, not gonna lie. Is World War III actually like a possibility now, and not just something in history books? And the more I look at all this stuff, I mean, we've got analysis from MRA Safety, those survival experts. We've got reports from Sky News and The Week, even public opinion polls, the whole shebang. And the more I read, the less sure I am about anything.
It's definitely a question that's getting harder and harder to just brush off, that's for sure.
Right. You'd think, like, with all our fancy technology and globalization, war would be this, like, barbaric thing of the past, right? But then I see a poll like this one from YouGov. Most Britons think WW3 is likely in the next decade. Suddenly, those history books are feeling a little too real.
Yeah. Public opinion is a powerful thing. It can actually become like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know? If enough people, especially people in charge, really believe war is inevitable, it creates a dangerous feedback loop. We saw this in the lead up to World War I. Ironically, back then, lots of folks thought war was impossible. They were so sure because of, get this, economic interdependence. How things turned out, huh?
And that's what's scary, assuming things will just, like, work out because of economics, that money will prevent war. I mean, everyone thought that about Russia, too, right up until, well.
Yeah, until the tanks started rolling. It's a sobering reminder that history rarely follows a straight, predictable line. And speaking of Russia and Ukraine, that's still very much happening.
And it seems like the West is, I don't know, hesitant to give Ukraine everything it needs to really kick Putin out. So let's say, hypothetically, Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine. Is that it? Or does he just, like, keep going? Like some of these experts are saying, pushing further into NATO territory and all that.
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer really hinges on understanding NATO. It's not just some random group of countries, it's a military alliance, a big one. And a core part of that alliance, the big rule, is that an attack on one member is an attack on all of them. It's right there in Article 5 of the treaty.
Okay. Yeah, Article 5, I've heard of it, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it means in, like, practical terms?
So in simple terms, if Putin, after Ukraine, sets his sights on, say, Poland, which has been a huge supporter of Ukraine, by the way, and crucially is a NATO member, that would trigger Article 5, like flipping a switch. And just like that, the entire NATO alliance, including the big guns, the U.S., would be obligated to respond. And not just with strongly worded letters, but with military force.
I can see why countries like Poland and the Baltic states, they're watching all this very nervously with Russia right there. It's like this high-stakes poker game, but with, potentially world-ending consequences. Even without NATO getting involved, though, the thought of another world war is just like terrifying. I mean, World War II, they say it cost something like $4 trillion in today's money.
Yeah, to put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire GDP of Germany today. Now imagine a conflict of that scale, but with all the added chaos of our modern world, cyber attacks shutting down entire countries, the very real threat of nuclear escalation. It's not a pretty picture.
Yes, suddenly those history books feel way too real. And here's a crazy thought. Even without a full-blown world war, the folks at MIRE Safety, the survival gear company, they point out that right now, as we're talking, there are at least 7 major armed conflicts happening around the world.
It's true, we tend to focus on Ukraine, understandably so, but you've got Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Haiti. Even Mexico is experiencing so much violence and instability due to the drug cartels that it qualifies as an active war zone by most definitions.
Man, that's sobering, to say the least. It really feels like the world is on fire right now, and we haven't even gotten to the possibility of those conflicts escalating or, some other global powder keg igniting.
And that's exactly the point. What makes a world war different from what we're seeing now isn't just the number of conflicts, it's the scale, the impact, the way they're all interconnected, pulling in more and more players.
Like, we're living in this weird in-between, not quite at war, but definitely not at peace either.
Exactly.
And the Middle East just feels like, I don't know, this powder keg ready to blow.
Right.
We've got the Israel-Palestine thing, which is, well, nothing new there, sadly. But now you've got Iran launching missiles. Hezbollah's getting in on the action. It's just a whole thing.
It's a region that's been on edge for decades, that's for sure. And these recent events, they're not helping, just adding fuel to the fire. What we're looking at now is this complex web of what they call proxy wars. Countries like Iran, they're backing groups like Hezbollah, almost like a mini Cold War situation playing out, with the U.S. backing Israel. And the scary part is, all it takes is one wrong move, one miscalculation, and things could easily spiral way out of control.
And we've seen that happen before, right? History's full of these conflicts that started small, but then, boom, they just explode.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, you've got a whole world war on your hands because of some regional dispute.
Exactly. World War I is a perfect example. Started with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. A relatively small event, you might think, in a relatively small country, right?
Right.
But within weeks, because of all the alliances and treaties, almost every major power in Europe was dragged into the conflict.
And boom, world war. Just like that. It's scary to think something similar could happen now, especially with so many potential flashpoints around the globe.
Absolutely, and that's why understanding the interconnectedness of our world is more important than ever. What happens in Ukraine, in the Middle East, even on the other side of the world, it has implications for all of us,
Huh.
economically, politically, even culturally. We can't afford to think of these conflicts as isolated incidents. They're all part of a bigger, much more complex picture.
Speaking of the bigger picture, we can't talk about potential global conflicts without talking about China, right? Their stance on Taiwan has always been a concern, but it feels like things are getting very real, very fast.
Yeah, and there are some analysts out there who are predicting a potential conflict as early as 2027, which is, well,
Not that far off.
right. And what's concerning is that China's approach, it's kind of mirroring what we saw with Russia and Ukraine. Remember how everyone just assumed that because of all the economic ties between Russia and the West, especially Europe, that war was basically impossible.
Oh yeah, everyone thought that.
And, well, we saw how that turned out.
So are we making the same mistake with China? I mean, they've
Yeah.
got their fingers in every economic pie imaginable,
They do. They've got deep economic ties globally, that's for sure.
but they've also been playing the long game, strategically building up their military for, like, ever.
They have. They've been investing heavily in all sorts of things. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and yes, expanding their military capabilities. It's this long-term strategy coupled with their increasingly assertive behavior on the world stage that makes them such a wild card.
A wild card, huh? So it's not just about watching the big players like the US, Russia, China. It's these other, maybe smaller players who might see an opportunity to make a move while everyone else is distracted.
Exactly. And to illustrate that point, let's talk about another wild card that often flies under the radar, North Korea.
Oh boy, yeah, them.
We haven't mentioned them yet, but they're a country with a history of, shall we say, unpredictable behavior.
To put it mildly.
They've got a growing nuclear arsenal, a long-standing alliance with China.
And they've been awfully quiet lately.
Right. Which, knowing them, might be even more worrying.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What kind of wild card move could they pull?
Imagine this. Tensions between China and the U.S. over Taiwan, they're at a boiling point. North Korea, they see an opportunity, and they decide to make a move. Maybe a missile test, but this time over Japan, or even a border incursion with South Korea.
Okay, yeah, that just sent chills down my spine.
It would be like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire.
Suddenly you've got the US, China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, all potentially dragged into a conflict that could easily spiral out of control.
And that's the point. These wild cards, these seemingly insignificant actors or events, they have the potential to completely upend the global order. And in a world as interconnected as ours, those ripples, they can travel further and faster than we might expect.
Wow, this is a lot to process. I don't know about you all listening out there, but I'm starting to feel like I need a map, a timeline, and like 5 cups of coffee just to keep up with all this.
Yeah.
But it's important, right? We can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend this isn't happening. I gotta say, it can be kind of overwhelming, all this talk of potential world wars and global conflicts. Honestly, it's hard to stay optimistic, Like, is there any good news here at all? Anything that gives you hope when you look at all this?
Well, I'd say there's always hope. Even with all these potential conflicts and scary trends, it's important to remember that we're also seeing a lot of global cooperation and communication
Right.
more than ever before, actually.
Really? Because honestly, scrolling through the news, it doesn't exactly feel that way.
I get it. The news can be, well, let's just say it doesn't always paint the rosiest picture. But think about it this way. During the Cold War, the entire world lived under this constant threat of nuclear annihilation for decades. And yet we avoided that outcome somehow. Why? Because communication, even if it was imperfect, was maintained. There were back channels, diplomacy, however messy it got, it continued.
So we've got those things going for us now, too.
We do. We have international organizations like the UN. They might not be perfect, but they provide a platform for dialogue. We have economies that are so interconnected, it's crazy. And yeah, that creates vulnerabilities, but it also creates huge incentives for cooperation and, not blowing each other up. And maybe most importantly, I think there's a growing awareness, especially among younger generations, that we're all in this together. We face shared challenges like hello, war, and climate change.
Okay, yeah, those are all good points. But even knowing all this, all the potential flashpoints, the interconnectedness, the risks, it still feels kind of, I don't know, powerless. Like, what can we even do? It's all so massive, so far outside our control.
I hear you. It's easy to feel that way when you're looking at global forces at play. But here's the thing, awareness is important, but without action, it's meaningless.
So what can we do?
Three things: stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
Okay, I like that. Simple but powerful.
Stay informed about what's going on in the world, engage in constructive conversations, don't just get sucked into the doom-scrolling vortex, advocate for peaceful solutions, even if it feels like a drop in the ocean, and never underestimate the power of hope, even when it feels naive. Because ultimately, hope is what drives us to create a better future.
Well said, well said. I think we all needed to hear that. This has been, to put it mildly, a lot. We've covered a ton of ground, explored some unsettling possibilities, and hopefully given you, the listener, a better understanding of this crazy, complex world we're living in. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Something for our listeners to ponder as they go about their day, now acutely aware of all the ways the world could, end.
How about this? The thing that sparks the next big conflict, the catalyst that could push us toward another world war, it's probably not going to be what we expect. It won't be some calculated move by a superpower on a giant chessboard. It'll be something small, something seemingly insignificant. A miscalculation, a misunderstanding, a tiny event in some forgotten corner of the world that spirals out of control.
Wow, yeah, that's a sobering thought. But it's also a good reminder that history rarely follows a straight line, and that every event, even the small ones, can have ripple effects that we never could have predicted.
Exactly. We're all connected, and our actions, our inactions, they have consequences.
Well, that is a lot to chew on for sure. Big thanks to you, expert, for walking us through this incredibly complex and, let's be honest, kind of terrifying landscape. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It's been real. Stay informed, stay engaged, and for goodness sake, stay hopeful. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, but until then, take care of yourselves and each other.